Dr. Paulina Jaramillo is a professor of engineering and public policy, as well as the co-director of the Green Design Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. She is also a lead author of the IPCC Working Group 3 report, Mitigation of Climate Change. Dr. Jaramillo, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is the third installment of the IPCC's sixth assessment. How does this report differ from the previous two reports?
The first report that came out in August focused on the science underlying the changes that are happening to the climate. So what do we know about those changes? The second report that came out in February focused on what are the impacts of those changes in the climate, impacts on natural and human systems, as well as opportunities for adaptation. And this report, the report by Working Group 3 that came out today, focuses on what are the needs for mitigating emissions of greenhouse gases that drive climate change.
And what did this report say about where we are compared to where we need to be in terms of global greenhouse gas emissions?
The report suggests, and our findings show that we are not on track to limit warming to the 1.5 degrees Celsius target that was implemented in the Paris Agreement. Average annual greenhouse gas emissions during the last decade, so since 2010, were the highest in human history. So we are really not on track to meet the 1.5 degree target. There is increased evidence of action happening. There have been sustained investments in energy efficiency. We've seen reduced rates of deforestation, as well as accelerated deployment of renewable energy. Those are good things that have been happening. They just need to happen much more rapidly within the next decade.
Is it still technically possible to limit warming to 1.5 degrees?
Yeah, so the report and the analysis suggests that it is still technically possible to reach the 1.5 degree Celsius target if we accelerate deployments very rapidly within the next decade.
Well, you mentioned some of the good things that have happened, but it's clearly not enough. At the press conference today announcing the findings of the report, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said that this report shows a litany of broken climate promises. Why do you think he characterized the findings this way?
Well, the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015, and it called for getting to 1.5 degrees Celsius target very clearly. And very soon after, we had the report on what would be needed to get 1.5. Now it's 2022, so that's 7 years since the Paris Agreement. And things have been happening, they just haven't been happening fast enough, and they have not been happening everywhere. So I think I can't speak for him, but I would imagine that that's what he means by broken promises. I imagine he also referenced or was referring to the gap in financing or the shortage in financing. The report, one of the chapters focused on financing and found that financing in the next decade has to be 2 to 5 times larger than it has been in the last decade. And the report also shows that the financing or the transfer of the $100 billion that was committed to transfer to the developing countries has not fully materialized. So I would imagine that that's where he was referring to broken promises.
The final draft of this report, as you are well aware, was delayed by a couple of days. Were there specific topics in this report that faced more scrutiny or pushback from certain countries that caused this delay?
So I've never been in the IPCC process before. And in my first time, not every author is involved in the plenary approval of the summary for policymakers. So on my first time, I got to be in the opportunity to be involved. So I don't have a reference point of comparison. I know that it was virtual, which I think probably does not facilitate things, and maybe things move more slowly because if it was virtual. That's just what I would imagine. I don't think people realize that the approval process is line by line. So every line of the summary of policymakers has to be approved, and that governments delegates from governments have to agree on, there has to be a consensus by all members of the delegations to approve each line. And so there's many different countries, and I'm sure there were some topics that were maybe much more controversial. My section actually went pretty smoothly, I think. So we didn't have any. I mean, you still have to go one by one line, and that still takes time. But I feel like maybe, and I don't have empirical evidence to prove this, but I feel like maybe the transport section in which I participated moved maybe faster than other.
So what was it like working on the transportation section of this report?
I mean, it's a lot of reading a lot of papers, and then drafting text and writing text. It's a lot of writing by committee, which can sometimes be, I mean, it's a large group of authors, each with different writing styles. So I was promoted to coordinating lead author last year and took a stronger role in the editing. And so that the month before submitting the final draft of the report in November was really, really intense. But it was really nice also to have the opportunity to meet people from many different parts of the world, to collaborate with our contributing authors who played a very crucial role in the work of the report. So contributing authors are invited by the lead authors because of the expertise, and we had a very strong set of contributing authors that helped with these. Sometimes there's tensions, like the disciplines are very different, and so sometimes like we don't speak the same disciplinary language, and so that can lead to maybe like confusion. So you have to get to the same. There's some growing pains as you get to the same understanding of where you're coming from. But I mean, it was a very interesting process. We just finished. It was a very intense weekend. I think I'll need more time to process it. I think right now I'm a little bit work functioning because of the adrenaline of getting the report out there, and it hasn't really dawned on me like what big accomplishment this is. So we'll see.
Well, let's dig into the report. Currently, how much of global greenhouse gas emissions come from transportation?
So the number is about 15% of greenhouse gas emissions globally come from the transportation sector. And that includes land use, so land use transportation, as well as shipping and aviation.
While other sectors' rates of annual increase in emissions are declining, at least their growth rates are declining. Transportation's annual growth rate is actually staying flat, around 2%. Why isn't transportation seeing the same levels of slowing growth rates and emissions as other sectors?
I think it's a combination of factors, right? We're still seeing population growth. We're seeing incomes grow, which means demand for services increases. But also, it's a difficult sector to decarbonize relatively to other sectors, right? When we talk about decarbonizing power plants, you have individual facilities where you're trying to decarbonize, and there are mechanisms. Here, we're trying to decarbonize every car, every vehicle on the road, right? We need to address every vehicle on the road. That means it involves everyone that moves. And it involves the decisions of everyone that moves around or buys things online that have to be delivered. So I think just maybe it's like, I see it as an energy modeler. I work a lot on power systems also. It just like the distributed nature of the emissions pose some challenges in terms of decarbonization.
Well, let's first look at personal transportation. What are the best ways to reduce emissions from transporting people from one place to another?
There's obviously a role for demand side management, and by that we mean reducing the demand of actually travel. And so there are intersections there between the transport sector and the urban sector. Denser, more compact cities with mixed use neighborhoods can really help reduce the demand for transport services. If you live closer to your work and closer to where you shop, then the travel distances are shorter. It's also easier, as the distances are shorter, it's also easier to either walk or bike or even take public transport because the distances are shorter. So there's a big role on the way we design the cities and how that affects our demand. There's opportunities for that systemic changes like teleworking. We saw how rapid the emissions from transport decreased when people had to stay home. And so there's definitely a role for demand side interventions. In terms of personal vehicles, so light duty transport, passenger transport, land-based, the report suggests that electrification offers the largest mitigation potential. And electrification of land-based passenger transport isn't just electrifying like cars. It also is electrifying two-wheelers and three-wheelers. Two-wheelers and three-wheelers are a big source, provider of transportation services in developing countries. And so electrification of those is also can also really help, and it's accelerating in a lot of developing cities, as well as electrification of the public transit systems, both intra-city as well as intercity. Now in the US, we don't have as much rail or public like buses. The system for moving across cities via land is not as robust as in other places. But investing on that and on that possibility could also reduce some of the emissions that are associated with aviation.
What's holding back electrification of personal vehicles?
Costs were a barrier, but costs are really decreasing, very rapid, have decreased and are decreasing, and will continue decreasing so that they're more accessible. The choices of electric, like if you wanted to look at what electric vehicle I could buy, the choices have been relatively small. So the increase in choices of electric vehicles now is not just Tesla. There are other players coming in with other models. So it isn't just like this type of vehicle, right? We've seen the availability now of like electric SUV. So that probably will also help as consumers have more choices. We still need the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure. And so here you have like kind of a chicken and egg problem. The investment in charging infrastructure will definitely be needed. Now, the other critical part of relying on electrification as a mitigation of the transport sector is we need low carbon electricity, right? So if we charge our cars with electricity generated with coal, that's not really going to help much. So at the same time as we're deploying electric vehicles and charging infrastructure, we need a rapid decarbonization of the transportation system.
Does this report look at sustainable transportation from an equity standpoint?
We mentioned it. We mentioned some of the equity implications, right? So investing in public transit and making transit more affordable and more accessible will provide more equitable access to mobility services. The literature suggests that there are some potential equitable benefits associated with like shared mobility or on-demand mobility, although that could have rebound effects. So we touch on the equity issues, but also the co-benefits associated with reduced, for example, pollution emissions. Those have equity implications as well, because we have shown, not in this report, but in other work we have done and has been reported, vulnerable communities also face more challenges with air pollution. And so decarbonization also can help with that.
Well, we know that long distance transportation and shipping are much harder to decarbonize than personal transportation. What solutions does the report offer to reduce emissions in those sectors?
So shipping and aviation in particularly are hard to decarbonize sectors. Electrification may play a small niche role in some short distance flights and ferries. But the findings of the report suggest that to meet the decarbonization targets that are consistent with 1.5 degree, there's definitely going to be a need for alternative low carbon fuels for those sectors, and those may include biofuels, sustainably produced biofuels, but also hydrogen and derivatives. For the shipping sector, for example, ammonia, which is a derivative of hydrogen. So low carbon, it has to be hydrogen produced also with low carbon processes, may be an option for shipping, and synthetic, what we call synthetic fuels, which are also hydrogen-based fuels that are then converted into synthetic fuels that can drop into the current engines, will probably be very crucial for aviation. For long distance, heavy land-based, long distance, heavy transport, so there are improvements in the battery technologies for trucks, for heavy duty trucks. Those can potentially be very useful in heavy trucks, like that have short distances, or like in mining operations. Those are heavy duty trucks that don't move very long distances. So electrification of those also is gaining momentum. For very long distance hauling, hydrogen and biofuels and synthetic hydrocarbons may also be needed.
Well, how do we ensure that developing countries get access to the same sorts of technology to help decarbonize their transportation sectors?
I think and so I actually do a lot of work right now on developing country. It's one of my passions right now, figuring out what a just transition looks like for developing countries. And the report does have a chapter on financing that talks about financing challenges and how financing is a barrier for developing countries. So the technologies that we have for developed countries can be used in developing countries. We just need to support their deployment through financing, through also capacity building. So there has to be the labor force that can support and operate and maintain these low carbon energy systems. But I do think that, and the report does suggest that the gap in financing in developing countries is large and needs to be addressed.
Well, what tools do policymakers have to decarbonize the transportation sector?
What tools? I want to make clear that the IPCC is not prescriptive. So the report doesn't focus much on a specific policy instruments. We don't discuss very specific policy instruments in the transport chapter. The policymakers, what we're presenting to policymakers are, these are the options. And now I think it's now the role of the decision makers to think about what instruments do you use to support these systems. From my previous work or my other work, and so not from the IPCC report, but there's a variety of policy instruments. There's standards, there's technology pushing, like research and investment support. So there's a variety of standards, and just the report suggests we need a portfolio of solutions. There's not one single bullet for meeting, again, not from this report, but from my perspective, there isn't a single bullet in terms of policy instruments. It's probably going to be also a combination of instruments that support the transition.
Well, yeah, I'd like to just learn a little bit more about your work in the research that you're doing at Carnegie Mellon. Well, what right now are you working on that's exciting to you about this transition to a more sustainable society?
So I work on energy modeling, and both at the macro level, and we're doing some work at the micro level. So in the context of the US, we're doing a lot of work on modeling the transition. And a lot of that work really in recent years has focused on better parameterizing the models to incorporate the technologies in the transport sector. Because the technologies in our energy system models, light duty vehicles, electric vehicles were very well characterized, but for the heavy duty and shipping and aviation, those have not been as well characterized. So the model didn't choose them. So we've been working on that. We're also very interested in working on better characterizing the opportunities for the industrial sector, so that we can see in an energy system model how those technologies may be deployed. And so we're doing a lot of scenario analysis to understand what are the drivers, what are barriers. We're looking at policy instruments. So in one recent paper, we were looking at whether in the context of the US, a clean energy standard tied to a zero emission vehicle standard, what is the level of reduction you can get from those compared to a carbon tax, which is the other instrument that is widely discussed. So we're doing that kind of work. And then I'm doing a lot of work in the context of sub-Saharan Africa, where I think there are a lot of opportunities for designing and operating new systems that are specifically designed for low carbon. In a lot of, so this idea of leapfrogging is really, I think it's really applicable to sub-Saharan Africa. Some of these countries have very small, let's see, Nigeria, a population of Nigeria, I think it's around 200 million. And the installed capacity of the power system is about 15 gigawatts. That's like 15 nuclear power plants, right? 50 gigawatts is like 15 nuclear power plants. So the infrastructure is very underdeveloped and will have to be developed. And so it will be, I think that's where there's the opportunity of building this infrastructure so that it's low carbon. The costs of low carbon technologies are decreasing. And I think the discussion should be about how these countries fund those investments. It shouldn't be about whether they should do them. I feel personally, it should be about how we can support their deployment, because the technologies are increasingly available and they're increasingly more competitive cost, but they are very massive investments that need to happen. So I think that's where the discussion, and so we're doing a lot of work to try to understand the dynamics of how the electricity system may evolve, what are low carbon pathways for the energy system as a whole, which means understanding what will demand for transportation services will look like in the future. So we're doing a lot of modeling on that in my research group.
All of that research sounds fascinating. Where can our audience find your work online?
So every time a paper comes out, I post it on Twitter. So if you follow me on Twitter, you can like the announcement will come out. And then you could also, I mean, academics, we need to do a better job at promoting our work outside of the regular academic channels. But if you are interested in actually reading the papers, you could put a Google Scholar alert for when my papers come out. Yeah. But we'll be working. We're trying to figure out how to do more outreach.
Well, we will link to your Twitter account in the show notes. Dr. Jaramillo, thank you again for all the work that you put into this report. And thank you so much for speaking with us today on the Climate Pod.
Thank you for having me. And I really hope people will look at the report. It can be a little overwhelming because it's a long report, but you have to read it in one sitting. You can make it long-term reading. This isn't a problem that will be solved in the next week. So take a year to read the report even, and figure out how we can collectively take action if we want to get to the 1.5 degree target.